Okay, well, welcome everyone. This is kind of the final culminating event of the Connexions. I'm just going to welcome everyone here. I'm sorry, I haven't remembered all of your names yet, but if you want to go across, introduce yourselves real quick. I'd love it if you could give us kind of like the 1-minute intro. I'll hold you to that standard, just kind of like we learned in the workshop for the sake of brevity, but also I think it'll just be a little bit better of a attention grabber there. And then could you just give us a brief overview of like where do you work and what's your focus? And obviously the topic is threat casting.
Threat casting. I'm Cindy Kuhn. I am the co-founder of the Threatcasting Lab, and I work for myself. I have the Applied Futures Lab, and Brian David Johnson and I co-do things. I never like to say run, because there are actually people who run things. We just founded that and we're there. And my work in the practice is the experiential human piece of the method.
Sandy Winkleman, creative director for Winkstinct Design. I'm in charge of the visuals, making sure everything looks good for the science fiction prototypes, and as well as the storytelling and making it all pretty and compelling and emotional and scary at the same time.
My name is Brian David Johnson. I'm a futurist. I'm a professor at Arizona State University, as well as a senior fellow at Phaedrus. I am the inventor of Threatcasting and the co-founder of the Threatcasting Lab with Cindy Kuhn. And I work with groups like this to actually do threatcasting and create possible and plausible threat futures so that we can figure out how to disrupt, mitigate, and recover from them. And I also feed Sandy the scripts for the sci-fi prototypes so he can tell me how bad they are.
I'm Greg Lindsay. I'm a newly minted non-resident senior fellow at the Threatcasting Lab, which goes nicely on the shelf with my other non-resident senior fellowships. In terms of focus, I worked with BDJ and Cindy on writing up the findings of past projects. I think BDJ once put it that I'm good to have because I can do the writing and I know just enough to be a little bit dangerous, which I think is a fairly good description of me.
How you doing? My name is Buck Owens, and I'm an analyst by trade and a sociologist by training. I'm here with the Threatcasting team. I've done, I think 4 or 5 Threatcasting events, but for this week, my focus for the team has been to sort of explore and experiment with this idea of storytelling after the fact. I'm playing around with the idea of storycasting, playing on the Threatcasting title.
I'm Jason Brown. I'm at the Army Cyber Institute. I'm a serving officer within the U.S. Army, and I think I'm Brian's first PhD student to actually use threatcasting to complete a degree in thinking about technology and humanity. The things that I study with my job in the Army are national security type threats and things that help prevent strategic surprise for the Army, I think. And threatcasting is the method of choice because we get to do some really dark, bad thinking about the future and then work backwards and go, how do we make it so it's not so bad for the Army?
Outstanding. And so just to backtrack just a little bit here, who would like to give us a good, succinct definition of what threatcasting is? What it is in praxis, and then what is the takeaway that we get from it? What is its value proposition?
That can be me. So threatcasting is an applied methodology. We look out 10 years into the future using subject matter expert interviews, looking at a specific research question or a specific area. We do participatory design where we work with groups, much like we did here at the conference, and we look for a range of possible potential threats. And then once we've identified those threats, we turn around and look backwards and say, okay, how would you disrupt, mitigate, and recover from those threats? And then more specifically, what are the indicators or the flags along the way that this threat is beginning to manifest over a 10-year timeline? We're generally looking 10 years out. The output of threatcasting is quite large. There's a very large data set that comes out of it. There is generally a report that really details all of the threats, all the findings, and all the actions, and often cites the subject matter experts that we've interviewed, and then also the analysts who are writing the report. We will often add supporting information, supporting research. And then oftentimes what comes out of that is a quick executive overview, a one sheet. And then as well, we use this thing called science fiction prototyping, which is science fiction based on science fact, as a part of the threat casting methodology. And because of that, we're modeling a person and a place experiencing a threat. We can then pick that up later, and much like we've talked about, where you can go and say, okay, if these are these instantiations of the threat, we can then turn those into science fiction graphic novels, we can turn them into animations or videos, we can turn them into short stories, just so that people can viscerally feel what these threat futures might be like.
Okay, so threat casting, as I understand it, would kind of guard against strategic surprise. I think it was just mentioned. And when a crisis occurs, decision makers would conceivably say, we've talked about this before, we know where to start. So can you give us like a vignette where the principles of threat casting would be applied, or a hypothetical where this sort of methodology would prove valuable? Like, what would that look like, let's say, at the US government? Pick a scenario.
Okay. A scenario that I use in with some of my students, all of it is hypothetical, but very plausible. We call it the Starfruit Lab scenario. It came from a threat casting event that happened several years ago, and I stole the name. But what I did, and I changed a little bit about the details. We imagine that an Israeli startup company that does genetic and computing on what do you call it? AI-driven precision health medicine, precision health and medicine. So I use that and go, what does that have to do with West Point or anything? I bring that into the classroom and say, this theoretical company gets bought by the Army in sort of a innovative way, and it's reassigned and pushed back to West Point, where there's 4,000 cadets, and they're a captive audience for precision health. And I use it in a cybersecurity class and go, how would I integrate this technology, this tool, inside of our networks? What kind of cybersecurity changes would you have to make the recommendations to the chief information officer? What kind of protocols would you need to have in order to update your cybersecurity training? In some of my other classes, I've done it before where I've asked questions about strategic security. How in the world do you do a tech transfer through multiple levels of different combatant commands, from Israel to the United States? Like we made the assumption that it came through like the Army Futures Command Innovation, and then to get it reassigned to West Point. But there's a technology transfer thread and some laws and policies that have to be followed for that. So I had them explore what are the policies and laws they have to negotiate in order to maneuver a foreign company into U.S. operations and research and development. And what's interesting about this is I proposed this idea to a colleague of mine. I co-teach a cybersecurity course with him. And I said, hey, this is a cool idea that I have, and I gave him all the details of it, and he goes, yeah, let's run with that. I'm not kidding. 2 weeks into the semester, I see a news article that the City University of New York and West Point had received $8.5 million from the National Institutes of Health to do precision health medicine and AI-generated studies at West Point. And then I look at the people who are the PIs on that, and my co-teacher was on that. He was a PI. So he turned around and looked at me and goes, yeah, I knew it was coming. I just didn't want to burst your bubble. So we use that in our class, and I do threat casting on that scenario in many different ways. We ask them to threat cast the cybersecurity part of it. We ask them to threat cast the implications to the health of the cadets, to leadership, and all those different varieties of threat casting. I can ask many, many different types of questions on a single scenario. So I have right now a data set of about a dozen different models that we've been developing over the course of about 2 years based on that one simple model.
Fascinating. And so we see this methodology kind of, becoming more mainstream, slash we've just heard of it. And this is certainly the first time I've heard of it, and it's fascinating. I see a very real military application just based off my own personal experience. But what will contribute to the efficacy and precision of threat casting going forward? And how does that methodology become more refined and accurate given the large data sets that you mentioned that you work with? And what does that entail?
So I think there's multiple steps into that. So the first is for our lab, or the Threatcasting lab, but also for the partnerships that we with West Point and the Army Cyber Institute, and also what we're doing here with the Global Disinformation Lab, is being able to take the methodology and teach it to more people, get it out there. It's great to hear you first heard about it. Welcome. So the idea is being able to take the methodology, just like any futures methodology, and actually go out and partner with people and teach them how to do it and have them pick it up. And then one of the things that we've been working on and that we did here actually at the Connect conference was looking at, could we create some online tools? Could we create some digital tools that would allow organizations to pick this up and do it on their own? And that's one of the things that at the very founding of the lab that Cindy and I have been trying to do, is trying to, how do you bring this together to kind of basically put threat casting in a box so that other people can pick it up? They can get trained on it, but they don't have to get a PhD in it like Lieutenant Colonel Brown here, but they could actually pick it up and go and use it. And so we're trying to lower the bar to make it easier and easier for people to be able to use their imagination, use their collective creativity to be able to think of these threats, and then very specifically tie it to how you disrupt them.
I'm going to add to that. 6 years ago, when I started my PhD program with Brian, I said, I'm sure there's AI out there that can help us generate scenarios to help us be creative. And we said, yeah, that's kind of cool. How do we do that? I don't know. I don't know how we do that. But now here we are in 2024, and we just got done doing 3 full days of grabbing, we had 6 different artificial intelligence tools helping us imagine futures. It was something we had anticipated 6 years ago, but we couldn't put it all together until today. So you ask about big data sets, and this is absolutely, I think, in the realm of how we have to approach futures thinking. I was talking with somebody last night, and I said, I think it was one of our Phaedrus folks. Imagine having data streams that you can analyze and see trends, that you can see the social trends and the technology trends and economic trends, much like the World Economic Forum does with some of their emerging technologies. What happens if you pipe those as inputs into your threat casting? And I want to carve out my space to be like this set of questions here, and you bring those all in, and those become your experts, are the curated wisdom of the crowd that you pull from many different places. Because right now our inputs are done because we know people, and we have experience with thought leaders in other locations, but we do it one at a time. We spend our personal and our professional capital inviting in experts to come and talk to us, but that's a lot of work. But we also can't make these anticipatory remarks and findings at speed. So we have to have tools that help us with at speed so that we can shorten the timeline between I have a thought, I have an idea, I have a research question, and I need an answer, but I need an answer in a week. I can't wait a year for the report to come out. So we have to find tools.
I'm going to add the human back in there so that we're also really clear that part of our exploration right now is, yes, let's make tools so that we can scale, so that we can go faster, but what we're up to right now still involves each of us as a human. But why that matters is because as we're building the tool or the tools to come that will allow for speed and scale, we are with intention watching what are we doing as human beings to create the engagement between the humans and the tools, so that we don't deploy tools that don't have the personality, the engagement, the opportunity for ahas. So that's the other piece that's really important that we're up to, is that bridge.
Okay, so I wanted to go back to the beginning. I think you mentioned we envision some very dark futures. It's kind of like the name of the game. And when we talk about sci-fi, it's not lost on contemporary American culture that dystopian futures are ever more popular of a genre. So that being said, within the context of threat casting, science gives us keys, but it doesn't tell us which doors to open. So what I'm getting at is, do you see any risks of this methodology being used in an unethical manner? And then, what would that look like should an adversary use it against us?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is exactly the case of, do not build the torment nexus. Oh, our new business plan is building the torment nexus. We're going to scale this up. The fact that all the dystopian science fiction, I would say certainly cyberpunk, which I think most of us in this group grew up on, given our ages, the fact that, Sterling and Gibson, all of them wrote those as cautionary tales, and then they were basically used literally as product roadmaps, as telling. So perhaps if BDJ and Cindy live long enough to be the villains, they'll see the same thing happen with threat casting, used to generate product ideas. In fact, yeah, someone probably is. In fact, that's probably Deloitte right now, actually, or somebody along those lines. So, but yeah, it's certainly a risk to this. I mean, threat casting still involves a mindset, to Cindy's point about the human, that that there are doors you don't want to open, and if you put these tools in the hands of people who want to open all the doors to basically extract as much profit out of it, then that will certainly happen. But that's why I think it's key. I don't know. I think it'll be interesting. That's why it's key to me about how you curate the groups and how you assemble it. So I did earlier question there about how this works with government. I spent last year at Cornell Tech basically running a large-scale threat casting exercise with current and former city public officials to think about threats coming from augmented reality at urban scale. So, for example, when Pokemon Go happened in 2016, there was estimates as many as 30,000 people were injured in the first 6 months from distracted drivers playing the game while driving. So, to me, it was used to answer the question, how do we anticipate and regulate and manage technologies that either don't exist or that are in their most nascent forms? How do we begin that preparation for that? And, that's something that, when done right and when done with the proper spirit, helps you prepare for these technologies coming down the pike and helps you anticipate what those adjacent possible spaces are. But yeah, to your point, you could put this in the wrong hands and you could actually use the same techniques to come up with the threats you were trying to avoid. And I should note, it's called threat casting, but it does have its silver lining twin, future casting, which we used in my project as well. We asked, what are the worst things that could happen with AR at scale? And then we also asked, what were the possibilities of AR at scale? And the findings basically mirrored each other. There was a positive and negative way. And what mattered was, in a way, leadership. And what mattered was the content around it. And to me, listening to the sessions here at Connexions, I think really underscored the fact that a lot of the threats that we're facing from disinformation and misinformation are the result of basically a society that's been in decay for decades now. I mean, listening to earlier sessions saying that perhaps if we stop societal collapse, our adversaries wouldn't be able to drive those wedges deeper into it. I think future casting helps us anticipate what those wedge issues can be and how we can start to turn that around.
And I would add that it does come back to both what Greg said and what Cindy said. It's actually all about humans. I mean, I tell my students all the time, you have a hammer and you use a hammer to build a house, and that's a great thing, but you can't build a hammer that's sufficient enough to build a house that's not sufficient enough to bash somebody's head in. But we're not all running around with hammers in our heads. It's because it's about the people. We have laws, we have culture, we have regulations, we have norms. There's ways that you build around it. Oftentimes, when it comes to these types of things, I always push people to remember it's about the people. If you're having a conversation about disinformation or misinformation, you're having a conversation about AI, you're having the wrong conversation. If you're just talking about the technology doesn't matter. It's about who's using the technology, and more specifically, who has the power, and how are they using, and where are they using that technology. And we're always going to have adversaries, and we're always going to have people who do that, so that ultimately what we put forward generally is to say we have to define these dark futures, because if you don't define them, you can't defend them. If you don't define them, you can't prevent it and guard against strategic surprise. That you have to go to those dark spaces so that you can come out.
Yeah, so I want to circle back to it's all about humans, right? And I had the pleasure of participating in your workshop, and we talked about how do you establish trust. And one of the things that was interesting is, we see how disinformation, propaganda, malign influence, all these things that we're encountering more so on a daily basis, and we're not really armed with the tools to encounter these sorts of things and threats. And it sows the seeds of discord, paranoia. You start seeing the emergence of extremist ideologies at a rate that's maybe alarming. And as a result, we see widespread mistrust in traditional media sources, and everyone has their own truth. And in that moment, it's kind of hard to find out what is the truth, what is truth. Like, is it essential? Is it not essential? We're not sure. So what I'm getting at is what are some ways in which officials and governments can match these new societal norms to foster trust? Because we see the fabric of society ripping apart, and I'm sure that's something that threatcasting could probably help with. So how do we survive in this new world?
I'll give you the short answer, and then I'll pass it to Cindy for the long answer. The short answer is you should see our findings from our workshop. They're actually published, and you can actually find them on the website, and we will make sure to share that. That's one of the things that we did over the 3 days, and as a part of this rapid threat casting was not only to do the threat casting, but also to answer that question, what are the things that people could do? And so we have all that listed out in the report.
Also, the whole idea around threatcasting is to bring in all kinds of voices. And so those voices are doing the best in that space, in that time, in that moment to represent all of the voices. So listening is super key when it drops down into this is who to listen to, these are the voices, hear that, and it's the action plan spaces. We might lift it up and say local government, but as it drops back into whoever is using the report and going to take action with it, the really important way to make these things effective is listen to all the voices, and then when it becomes local, make it local, get in touch with the people who are the trusted sources. You cannot come in from the outside and build that ever, ever, ever. And another phrase we like to say, I realize I have all these lab things we say all the time, but it's true. The future is local, everywhere. It is. So I think that's the pieces. It's in there. We put it right in the reports. We tell you who to talk to, and then if we're abstract, go local and start asking.
I'm going to add, I think, one more point to Cindy. I'm going to actually go just a little bit more local than local. I'm going to say it's personal. If you see that there's this threat coming up and you maybe have some insider knowledge because you've read a report or you've participated in a threat casting, and if you don't see yourself as part of the solution, you didn't do it right. You didn't put enough into it to imagine yourself in the solution. In other words, I say you don't put any skin in the game means you're not going to contribute to the solution. So politics might be local, solutions might be local, but it's still passive voice. It's somebody else at the local level. Well, you can't get much more local than yourself and your immediate family. And I think that's where a lot of at least the next level of analysis and the next level of findings would be is how do I, on an individual level, contribute to a solution? We talked about one of our findings as being community-centric communication. Well, community-centric communication is maybe the person who's part of the solution walks around and actually hands out the flyers or the news or the piece of paper rather than thinking that someone else passively is going to do that for you.
I want to jump in with one thing here about threatcasting itself in terms of trust. One of the things that I like about it as a writer is that it is intrinsically story-driven, which also means that participants have to basically create stories and make meaning together. And so that process of having to, basically decide collaboratively what kind of story they want to tell, what kind of protagonist, what the meaning is in it, I think is inherently that kind of bringing together of trust-building process. I come back to the Knight Foundation, almost a decade ago, was funding projects that were interested in bringing together strangers in public space to have conversations. They argued that was the fundamental building block of democracy bureaucracy. And so I think both our finding reflects that from today, and then also, Threatcasting itself is that kind of conversations in public with strangers and building that sort of shared narrative together, because that's, of course, what we're missing. We're missing a shared narrative about the future. I think I would argue is America's maybe biggest problem right now.
To your question about what can be done, I think we're still working on that, right? That was some of the things that we were doing this week. Was we know the process works, right? The process is routinely said. I don't think that the answers. I would argue that the answer to your question is not complete yet. We're still going to discover new ways to make the outcomes of threatcasting more realistic. And again, I think the model sets itself apart from and there are other forecasting models out there. But what sets this one apart is it forces the entire thing down to an individual. And that is what makes it very compelling. You can do a lot of future foresight work at the discipline level. You can do it at the industry level. You can even get down to the organizational level. But here, there is a person doing a thing, and it's both in the event and the recovery of it. And so to answer your question, how do we and what do people do next? I think in the future, because we're futurists, we're going to get these two, they're going to get better at answering that question, because the work that we did this week gave us all sorts of new insight on what makes something compelling and grab somebody's attention. Because that, I think, is the first step to your question is, have we grabbed anyone's attention?
Yeah, so I'll change change this up a little bit here. So we talked about earlier how, with threatcasting, we can identify these threats, hypothetical as they may be, and then we say, well, here's how we would react to it, and we can practice that in a training environment. And I'm thinking maybe a military would find this very useful in the context of, say, when you red team it. And what I mean by red teaming is it's a phrase where think as the enemy does, right? How would they attack your plan? So there's an action, a reaction, and a counteraction. So do you ever see, it's one thing to threatcast all these potential threats in the future, but you start putting these on the shelf, and it's like, we've already seen that. But if they just kind of start collecting dust and they're not constantly revisited and reevaluated year by year, then it's maybe like the fruits of your labor are kind of going to waste. But do you ever see a future where threatcasting is actually put more into action, be like, hey, here's something that we haven't thought of before because we just didn't invest enough in creativity, and this methodology kind of enables that. So now that we have more creativity, we've actually identified a real threat with some data to support that this actually is credible. It could very well happen. So we start putting that into action. Does that, kind of fit into the method afterwards? How does that look into actually producing some fruit in terms of like national security, or even a corporation might do that for commercial purposes? What are your thoughts on that?
The answer is yes. So the idea is that with threatcasting, it is not a one and done thing. It's actually not you do it and it's done and you produce the report and you put it up on a shelf. And that, I think, is a misconception, because actually a lot of futures work and a lot of foresight work actually does do that. It's like, well, here's the big finding, and we'll go back to it. These are the 10-year out threats. Actually, how threatcasting, when it has been used with great efficacy, both by industry, with people like the Intel Corporation and MasterCard, or places like the Army Cyber Institute in the Army, or the Secret Service, or the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, it's actually a methodology that is done year over year. And it's something that then gets socialized where, yes, granted, sometimes we do it over 2 days or over 3 days like we did here, but sometimes people then, once they've done it and they're starting to develop that body of knowledge, they do it again. And they do it in a small team that's a rapid deployment to solve a really small problem. And they'll do it again, and they'll do it again, and then they create mechanisms to then track it. Because when we're talking about threatcasting, it's not about identifying a range of possible potential threats and what you would do about it, but also the indicators over time. And that indicators are really important at the beginning because you're watching the manifestation of the threat over time. And it's not a signal, it's none of that, it's not a trend. It really is very, very specific. It is a policy change. It is a piece of technology that is released. It is a cluster of investments that have been made. It's things that are really quantifiable, and you can watch it so that organizations, whether they be the military or private industry, can begin to take action. and they can begin to do it, and they can begin to say, oh, I remember we talked about this, let's bring it in. It usually gives them about a 3 to 6 month advantage, but then they can quickly deploy a small trained team that is pulled from previous reports to then actually go and investigate something really, really specifically. And there are lots of examples of that where it's happened in the past, whether that be through when COVID happened. We had a lot of organizations that would brought us in to actually go and look at COVID. Had we looked specifically at a global destabilization brought about by a virus? No, we talked about it a little bit, but not specifically COVID. But we had done a lot of global destabilizations. We had done a lot of regional destabilizations based upon climate, based upon other factors, which we could actually take those learnings and then very quickly do a rapid threat casting looking at the effect of COVID and again, it's an applied methodology, so we could look at how could it inform and provide a framework for decision makers with mayors, with people in policymakers, with industry leaders, being able to actually inform looking at COVID. And it worked for 3 months out, 6 months out, 12 months out, 18 months out, that people were able to do that. So ultimately, getting back to it, when organizations bring it in, it actually needs to be normalized inside the organization, where you have a bunch of people, and it's not just bringing us in to rapidly deploy and go and do it. It's actually something that year over year over year, people are using and then constantly refining. The really, I think, impressive work that we did with the Army Cyber Institute for about 3 years was looking at the future of information warfare, where we started looking at the effect on supply chain, and then it moved to the weaponization of artificial intelligence, and then it moved into the gray area of how it might affect populations, and then it moved into how could information warfare affect deployed individuals who are out there. So it was taking this body of knowledge and kind of moving it around to better define it, leading all the way up to the most recent one we did with the Army Cyber Institute and the Secret Service, looking at micro-targeting, something very specific, which I'm sure we talked about here at Connexions. So it is this body of knowledge and this methodology that needs to be normalized inside an organization.
I want to add to that just a real quick thing too. It also crisscrosses because most of the work is done 10 years out into the future. So a quick example of BDJ and I working on the rapid COVID with one of our partners, Dr. Tim Lant, and his lab. That same work that we did, we pulled that data just this past June on work we did with NOAA on heat and air in the same area in Arizona and Maricopa County. And we were able to pattern behaviors from the work we had done in 2020 with how those folks were reacting to match it with heat and activity. So you can bring it in and look at similar threats crisscrossing across content too. Greg.
I was going to say, more broadly speaking, I think most organizations make the mistake of obsessing over strategy and overlooking serendipity, in the sense of, serendipity today is considered good luck, but the original meaning of it, particularly in the sciences, where serendipity's played a role in everything from antibiotics to Viagra, that is an unsought finding. And to achieve something with serendipity, you have to have the discipline to recognize it amidst what else you're reconnoitering, and being able to pivot to take advantage of it, and then, of course, incorporate it into your organization. And that's one of the things that I like about threat casting, is that even though the questions are structured and you bring groups together, it produces many unsought findings. And it does, to the earlier points, it builds up that capability to be able to understand what those findings mean and being able to plan accordingly. And I just think in general that, that the way we perceive leadership is that you build a team, you set a strategy from the top down, and you relentlessly pursue it. And in a world that we are with the only accelerating thing is change, that to deal with that acceleration and the rate of change, that you need to be able to be much more open to unsought findings and incorporate them into your mental models. And this is a discipline that does exactly that.
You asked about how it might apply military planning, military red teaming. Well, we get some mixed emotions at certain levels. And a lot of this is because sometimes the military doesn't train lateral thinkers. They train very literal thinkers. Cause and effect, follow orders, here's the planning methodology. And we do very well at making people follow that mold. When someone is a lateral thinker, sometimes their ideas don't get enough momentum to get off the ground, But others, when they do, they're wildly successful for a short period of time, and then that person changes out. So we have anecdotes of senior leaders within the military love the simplicity of the graphic novella. It teaches a single lesson, and general officers will have it on the reading table in their offices. And we have others who come and ask us, "You spent how much on making comic books? The Army actually did this?" So it's a mixed bag. The same thing with the methodology itself. Every time that we talk with the people who contribute from the Secret Service or the FBI or the intelligence community, the individuals in the room say, "I can see how this is helpful," and they want to do more of it. But then it becomes, how do I sell this within my own sphere? It takes a little bit of knowledge about how to do it. It's not a lot, but there is a tremendous amount of people work that goes on behind the scenes of creating an efficient and believable product at the end. The other part of it is it is story driven and it's human centric. There aren't a lot of numbers. There aren't a lot of quantitative data points that someone can say, "Well, my trend line goes this way, therefore it must be a better solution." Once again, our literal thinkers within the military like those trend lines, and the lateral thinkers are the ones who get sociology. You know, the experiment with the human trained teams within Iraq was right, was correct. Now, there might have been some management issues with it. There might have been some misunderstandings, but we couldn't win a conflict without engaging to the population. And over time, certain leaders didn't see the value of engaging on an individual, on an ethnographic level, and the human train system collapsed. Well, other leaders were forward-thinking, and they were the ones that brought that around. Now, the special operations community understands very, very clearly that engaging on an individual level is the right way to win conflicts in certain circumstances. So right now, we have a mixed bag within the Army of people who are advocates and people who are just sort of apathetic about it. It just has not yet reached a critical mass for us to teach us on a wide level. Which is why I'm really happy that the leaders that I work with within 2 or 3 different academic departments allow me to do this in a classroom setting. So I am expanding and breaking the brains of cadets who are not yet those senior leaders. I'm trying to get them to think laterally rather than just, literally and linearly. And maybe by the time I retire for the second time, I might get a reach back from one of those cadets that said, "Hey, I just implemented this in my unit, and we are one of the most successful units." I'm waiting for that phone call. It might not be anytime soon, though.
I'd like to throw a thought into that. I have no data to prove this, but from my observation, when I see the people I see most engaged with, not just the process, but the outcomes, again, please don't kill me, I don't think it's people my age. I can't prove it, maybe we should do a study, I think it is the younger generations that are going to get this. And I think to the earlier question, how do you engage people? Maybe it's focusing on the people who really will want to get this. And I am optimistic. And that's what I want to end this with. I'm optimistic that this will only gain traction as this generation down here ends up in these leadership positions. I think there's an opportunity for that exponential growth there with that change of demographic. That's my hope.
I'm going to play moderator myself for a second here because I'm usually the host of such podcasts. And I would ask BDJ and Sandy, because Sandy's been conspicuously quiet. Have you ever done memes as an output of science fiction prototypes? There's a lot of interest in this, but how do we think about it from a communication standpoint beyond graphic novels are wonderful, but can we do it in meme form? Can we use it to create our own information factory?
We have done, and then I will pass it to Sandy, we have done rapid science fiction prototyping, rapid threat casting, using Twitter as a platform to do it. And so creating that as a platform and creating these tiny little science fiction prototypes, these tiny little visions for the future, and being able to kind of get those out and get those to be then retweeted and going viral and people add into them and things like that. And that was done in conjunction with a group over in the UK that was actually going through and doing it, and it was quite successful.
It's a good idea. I like it. If we could get it going, that'd be clever. Right now, I mean, we basically make SFPs that are, I guess, the shortest, like 4 pages. Something that's really...
We've done a couple that are 1 pages. We've done the 1 pagers for some companies and things like that, which are, and it's kind of straddles an infographic. So it kind of looks like an infographic, but it's an infographic set in the future that has a few characters in it. If you can wrap your head around that. Imagine, if you will, an infographic with characters set in the future.
Yeah, it's true. Just getting the basic information across as quick as possible. But yeah, I like that idea of doing a meme. Just something that would like spread virally would be really cool. It'd be really helpful. But right now we use the SFPs mostly to get people engaged in the bigger picture, whether to get them to read the reports or just get the gist of what we went over in a workshop or whatnot, and getting people involved. And it was like Jason was saying, like, high kernels or whatever will have these SFPs on their tables, and like that blows me away. That like people will read this, and we've gotten responses from that and accolades from people that I wouldn't expect that have read these books. It's an easy way for people to digest the information and get it out there and spread it.
And what we've just seen is a new idea that has just gotten hold with this group, and I bet, if I were to bet, that's going to happen pretty soon. It's going to be beta tested by this group. Absolutely. That's how quickly and agile this group is.
And that is how the U.S. Army meme operations group got started, ladies and gentlemen.
Into this one. No. That might be Basil's the next thing. He's got the chops for that.
I have advised the dissemination of certain memes, but that's another conversation for sure. Anyways, any closing comments or any questions from the crowd? All right. Well, on behalf of the University of Texas and the Connections Conference and Podcast, thank you so much for your valuable time and your insights. Truly fascinating stuff, and I can't wait to see what it produces in the future.
Thank you.